we're going to be dealing with something that's quite difficult.
Secondary history teaching is a complex business with multiple approaches. In this programme, we've gathered together a group of respected educators and historians to discuss some of the issues around history teaching. The group consists of Tristram Hunt, academic historian and broadcaster, Christine Counsell, Cambridge senior lecturer and editor of Teaching History, Ros Ashby, lecturer and researcher at the Institute of Education, Ben Walsh, history teacher and author, and Jonathan Howson, a history teacher in London. They have just watched one of Jonathan's Year 11 lessons concentrating on second-order concepts, in which pupils used archive sources to test a well-known hypothesis about Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's a real case of Khrushchev, it's your move or the end of the world.
There were two key things that stood out, I think, from the lesson. One is treating the children as grown-ups. And I think the other aspect of it was that the knowledge, the substantive knowledge that you were giving them, you were demonstrating that it isn't static knowledge, that actually they can engage with this, and that the whole issue of history is that it's partly a debate about the past, partly a debate about its significance and how we interpret it.
I strongly agree with both those points, and I was struck by how engaged those students were, and that was remarkable and really, really exciting. And I'm sure if there were teachers watching this, they might say, oh, that's exciting, that's worth aspiring to, but how did he do it? And of course, the answer to that how I know is going to be not just in that lesson, but it's going to be in all sorts of things about classroom culture, about how you built it up over time, because these were youngsters who present all kinds of challenges, I'm quite sure, and in less capable, less skillful hands might not be so mature. And I really wanted to ask you, Jono, if you were asked, how did you get them to treat that material so seriously?
You have to have a depth of knowledge about the subject to begin with. I also think you need to have, because it directly translates into the classroom, you have to have a passion about and a commitment to what you're delivering. And not only that too, but they have to understand that the context within which this is being delivered. They have to see that this is relevant to their lives today. That engages them to be involved.
I think this is very interesting. The combination of passion and authority is what gets people interested and what gets viewers. You can't just have passion, you can't just be dry and authoritative. It's the combination of the two to draw people in. I mean, I think what I particularly enjoyed about the lesson, and I think it's an interesting debate at the moment, is that so much of it was almost a lesson in citizenship and political engagement and political literacy.
Because they can't be separated.
No, exactly. And I think in some of the citizenship debates going on at the moment about the curriculum, this sort of side of history, as if this hasn't been taught, you know, and this hasn't been a vital part of historical knowledge. And it was all there. I mean, out of that lesson, I saw it became a much more engaged, critical, involved citizenry.
What I would point to is the way in which you simply assumed, there was no question that your students would not be able to handle this sort of really quite challenging material. You know, original documentary sort of footage was also you know, some materials right out of the archives. These were minute papers, weren't they? That Kennedy was.
And the text of the speech too, and everything.
That's right, and these are not written in simple, straightforward language at all. And yet you sort of gave no hint to the students. You almost gave them no opt-out.
There is an overarching theme which isn't actually stated but which is implicit in the whole thing. It is much more one of where do these students place themselves in the world today as a result of this kind of knowledge. And I think if somehow you can do that, then it immediately becomes relevant and current. If you can't do that, then you often will have an uphill struggle.
And this is just a health warning, not an exercise in simply finding extremes. You can have a situation where an action that's been undertaken is both brave and unwise.
I think probably what was important was actually the upfront teaching. Jonathan set the parameters and he set those extremes. It wasn't going to allow the children just to sit in, you know, good, bad, you know, hero or villain, and all those sort of crudities that exist. He mapped on that grid all those ways in which, the complex ways in which and he spoke of a continuum, so that the
wa-
children were
wasn't it one-
allowed to unpack that across those
Wasn't it terrific,
areas.
though, when they just ever so slightly threw you by changing the shape of the continuum? Well, fantastic, because you had something that didn't go across that way, it went diagonally instead.
I love the way you use the negative constructively, but basically you told them, this is what I don't want, okay? We're ruling this out of the discussion, and then shaped and disciplined their discussion, because they were highly disciplined, I thought, across the lesson, and that was because of the framing you gave them, so they were not allowed just to drift into flights of fancy.
You also addressed this question of the right or wrongness of the American position, which, and you know, if nothing else sort of comes across from this lesson, is you didn't have to do that for your exam course, and yet by, you know, which was the bit you drop? You know, you wouldn't drop that, would you? To get students actually engaging with this idea, should they have done that? You know, is worth.
But can't they write more powerfully than on any number of issues as a result of that? Or potentially can't they write more powerfully as a result of having looked at something like this? Because then doesn't that become a focus for their whole understanding of the whole Cold War and in anything that they'll write about?
One of those sentences from one of those boys about lionising capitalism was a beautiful, you know, incredible sentence. And I think it's almost part of the richness and reward of history is the writing of it. And it can't all be sort of gobbets and bits of analysis of things. That you've got to bring it together,
Absolutely.
I think.
This is why we've seen, you know, such a revival in extended writing in school history, because I mean, that passion's very much shared. One danger of a sort of perhaps purely skills-based focus was to drift into the gobbet instead of joining things up and constructing argument and developing debate. And we've now got a range of pedagogies which explore that. And I think it's widely accepted, actually, that to write is to think, and to think is to write, that you often need that scribbling process to form your thoughts. I think what history gives you is something to argue about.
It also gives you a body of prior models where somebody has argued about.
Yes.
So you can actually take the article from the 1962 encyclopedia on something and compare it with, you know, a more up-to-date account which has slightly different nuances, for
That's
instance.
also vital in teaching them the excitement of history. Ideally, you want to end up with the quote-unquote right answer, but what is important is you take a stand, you argue it, you know, conclusively, you draw on the evidence, and you take the reader along with you, and you end up somewhere different from where you began. And you know, if it's got that, then I'm very happy.
This is part of his performance. I mean, his performance during the Cuban Missile Crisis focused around what he did on television. But we're still skirting around the core issue, which I'm trying to get at.
Time is always an issue, and what we have to be careful as teachers is to avoid the trap of saying, have you done Afghanistan this week? Have you done Poland? So that it doesn't become an exercise in just simply delivering curriculum as quickly as possible.
It also means hard choices have to be made.
Absolutely.
Which means that a teacher will, I think, quite defensively say, well, I need to get some sense of overview here, but there are many kinds of overview. And I'm going to have to plump for this because I've got an hour a week. And I've got to make hard choices about how to move these children forward on all fronts. And I think that's why things do get left out for good reason.
Because you cannot include in a school history syllabus everything that ever happened everywhere that you can possibly imagine and everybody's favourite thing. But what you can give is you can give children a framework of understanding for lifelong learning, and that history teaching then and history understanding does not stop when people leave the classroom.
Well, I thought that was the excellence of the lesson, because hopefully all those kids will be looking at the sort of, you know, Iraq war memos and the, you know, the Bush-Blair stuff and all the rest, and thinking, well, hey.
At the big scale, it seems to me that ultimately it's ambition that comes out. You're ambitious that this process doesn't become grad grind. If it's the 19th, it must be Poland. You're also ambitious for the students. You know, for students sort of who from that background, you know, it would be so tempting to sort of say, oh, well, I'd better keep it simple, and you clearly didn't.
But I don't feel I have to, you see.
But that's the point, isn't it? There is this temptation to sort of under-challenge because we don't want to threaten students.
But does that come from this fear of this fear of differentiating, and then differentiating, reading, dumbing down, and then as opposed to saying in addressing something like a second-order concept that has many gradients and many levels of progression, that by keeping the whole discussion high, you still will drag everybody along at some level.
I suspect, in fact, that it's actually more to do with the complex business of managing the big thing that you're trying to achieve, but also being aware of the small steps.
And that longer term understanding of what you're trying to achieve with the children does allow you actually to differentiate within a class.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the question you might ask, or you might notice one child can fly with the ideas that you've perhaps got in mind for several lessons later. Whereas with other children, there you are, you think, I'm going to have to do something now that's actually going to reinforce and consolidate this understanding here, while I've got to deal with this one who's ready to move forward. And part of the juggling of the kind of interventions that the teacher is making all the time, but you can't do that without the sequence of lessons and the long-term goals in mind, because you don't know where you're taking them next.
And you've articulated something that I don't actively think about, because when I do think about how I prepare lessons and how I teach, I never actually think on lesson by lesson. I always try and think of a longer time span and even a mini scheme of work within a scheme of work. I try and think of things over, 4, 5, 6 lessons, because I can't help but feel that to make any kind of progress, that progress has to be a gradual process of change. But I never ever think in single lessons.
Teachers often say, don't they, oh, how do I know, should I have departed from my lesson plan or shouldn't I have departed from it? Which is best? But it seems to me that you exemplified very helpfully there what it is that can help you make those judgments, in that you were paradoxically very clear about what you wanted to achieve. You're very, very clear about your second order area that you wanted to explore, very clear about its relationship with substantive content. And because you're so intellectually clear about where you're going, you can make the small judgments. I think I'll give some latitude there, that's worth running with. And, oh no, I think I'll let that go. But you can't, that's the paradox. Plan it well and then you can depart from the plan.
Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, acted out of a desire to seem strong, to lionise capitalism and demonise communism.
Kennedy's actions were clever and well thought out because they left the decision on what Khrushchev's plate.
His personal vendetta with Khrushchev led to actions that would not be diplomatically wise.
Very good. Thank you very much.
One of the things that I find most exciting from that lesson, and from all kinds of other similar practice that I'm seeing around the country, is that there are children here who may not go on to do even History A-level, possibly not even History at GCSE, who nonetheless can engage in these processes, can acquire a voice, can develop a critical understanding, can get excited about issues of identity and others' identity. So really, for me, what is particularly exciting is this question of inclusion. And that's an area where I think we've moved forward in history education.
What I certainly valued from it was the citizenship and the political literacy. And again, even if they don't continue from that class, from that course, I think they've understood an incredible amount about the nature of power, the nature of imagery, and the nature of America in the 20th century, which is so vital today.
Many students, I think, get a very packaged version of the past with neat sources and photographs arranged, and I just so much enjoyed. I'm sure you do use textbooks as well, but it was just so nice to also see students within that examination course working with the rough edges of history, with archive film, rough looking photocopies. Once in a while, I think, just to be honest with students and say, this is where the history comes from, this is where the nice textbook started out. And sometimes I think it's a good idea to look at the building blocks of history.
In many ways, he's not just engaged in a practical activity, he's actually engaged in an intellectual activity, and that's both at the level of intellectual engagement with history, but also intellectual engagement with how people learn, how children learn.
Yeah, I know that if you have that sense that what you're delivering is not simply an exercise in managing curriculum, but it's actually something that's going to help all these people, all these students in their lives, whether or not they take history. If it gives them some currency in the world that they live in, then that can't be a bad thing.
For access to the full discussion, go to www.teachers.tv.